If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. The sun was setting over Miami Beach, painting the sky with golden hues that reflected in the mirrored windows of Atlantic Tower, an imposing 20-story building where Richard Sullivan occupied the penthouse, one of the most successful and mysterious businessmen in Miami. At 58, Richard had built an empire in the construction industry, but lived like a ghost in his own palace of glass and marble. The duplex penthouse was decorated with valuable art, pieces, exclusive designer furniture and cutting-edge technology, but none of this could fill the deafening silence that dominated the environment. Each object seemed to tell an interrupted story, as if time had frozen exactly 20 years ago, when Elizabeth, his wife, departed this world after a long illness. That night, like all others, Richard dined alone on the balcony that offered a panoramic view of the shoreline. His austere face, marked by deep wrinkles that betrayed more suffering than age, remained impassive as he mechanically enjoyed the dinner prepared by the housekeeper. "Excuse me, sir," said Gerald, the butler, who had served him for more than 3 decades. "I need to inform you that Mrs. Jenkins, the cleaning lady, has decided to retire. She sent this letter saying goodbye and thanking you for the years of service." Richard showed no reaction. Jenkins was just another employee, although she had been there almost as long as Gerald. People came and went in his life without leaving marks. After Elizabeth was gone, he had become impermeable to new bonds. "Hire someone," he replied dryly, without taking his eyes off the horizon where the city lights were beginning to shine. Gerald hesitated for a moment. "I've already taken care of it, sir. A young woman presented herself today with excellent references. Her name is Sarah Rodriguez. She will start tomorrow if you authorize it." Richard merely nodded, dismissing the butler. It made no difference who would clean the empty rooms of his existence. The only person who mattered had departed, leaving behind only memories that haunted him in every corner. The next morning, while working in his dark wood-paneled office, Richard heard something that hadn't echoed in that apartment for a long time. A melody. Someone was humming a popular American song with a sweet, tuneful voice. Intrigued and slightly irritated by the break in the silent routine, he got up and followed the sound to the hallway. That's when he saw her for the first time. Sarah was a little over 30, light brown skin, curly hair tied in an unpretentious bun, and a smile that seemed to illuminate the environment around her. She was cleaning the windows with rhythmic movements, completely absorbed in her task and her music. "Could you please make less noise?" Richard's deep voice cut through the air, making Sarah start. "1,000 apologies, Mr. Sullivan." She turned, surprised but without losing her smile. "I didn't realize I was bothering you. It's just that I have a habit of singing while I work. Helps the time pass faster, you know. But I promise to stay quiet." There was something in Sarah's disarming manner that caught Richard off guard. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him with such naturalness, without the reverential fear that his figure imposed. "Just keep the volume down," he replied, trying to maintain a serious face, but without managing to imprint his usual coldness in his voice. Sarah nodded energetically. "You got it. I'll sing just to myself like this," and she demonstrated, whispering the melody comically, as if telling herself a secret. For a very brief instant, something like a smile threatened to appear on Richard's lips, but he quickly composed himself and returned to his office. However, for the rest of the morning, he couldn't fully concentrate on his numbers and contracts. The melody, even having ceased, seemed to persist in the air like a stubborn perfume. In the days that followed, Sarah's presence became a disruptive constant in Richard's monotonous routine. She was efficient in her work. He couldn't deny that. But she carried with her an energy that violently contrasted with the somber atmosphere of the penthouse. The rooms seemed brighter when she passed through, not just because of the impeccable cleaning, but because of something inexplicable that emanated from her presence. One morning, as Richard was having his coffee in the dining room, he observed Sarah organizing the books on the bookshelf. She occasionally stopped to examine some title with genuine interest. "Do you like to read?" The question escaped his lips before he could contain it. Sarah turned, surprised that he had initiated a conversation. "I love it, but I don't have much free time. I work in 2 houses and I'm still studying at night." "What are you studying?" Richard surprised himself with his own interest. "Education. I want to be a teacher," she replied with shining eyes. "I've always thought that teaching children is like planting seeds of hope, you know? We don't see the result right away, but one day it bears fruit." The metaphor hit Richard like an unexpected wave. Elizabeth also spoke like that, with metaphors full of life and hope. She had been a music teacher, believed in the transformative power of art in people's lives. "You can borrow any book that interests you," he said, rising abruptly to hide the emotion that memory had awakened. Sarah's face lit up. "Really? Wow. Thank you so much. I'll take care of it as if it were my own, I promise." That night, for the first time in years, Richard went to the room that had remained untouched since Elizabeth's departure. It was a silent sanctuary, with the white grand piano she had loved so much, sheet music still organized as if waiting to be played, and photographs frozen in time. He sat on the edge of the bed and allowed the memories to flow. Why did that young cleaning lady remind him so much of Elizabeth? There was no physical resemblance between them, but something in the essence, in the way of seeing life with hopeful eyes, established a disturbing connection. Richard didn't know it, but that simple gesture of offering a book marked the beginning of a crack in the wall he had built around his heart, a small fissure through which, after 20 years, a thread of light began to penetrate the shadows of his existence. The weeks passed, and gradually, Sarah's presence became less of an invasion and more a part of Richard's routine. It was curious how he began to anticipate the days she would come to work in the penthouse. Without admitting it to himself, his ears were alert to the sounds of her arrival. The discreet noise of the elevator, the cheerful greeting to Gerald, the melodies she hummed while working. One rainy morning in June, Richard was surprised by a scent he hadn't smelled in his house for a long time, the sweet and cozy smell of cornbread. Following the aroma to the kitchen, he found Sarah removing a golden form from the oven, while animatedly chatting with Mrs. Wilson, the cook who had worked in silence for years. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," Sarah greeted him with her usual radiant smile. "I hope you don't mind, but today is Mrs. Wilson's birthday, and I asked Gerald's permission to use the kitchen. It's my grandmother's recipe, cornbread with guava paste." Richard was momentarily without reaction. The tacit rules of his house were being broken one by this woman, but strangely, he couldn't feel angry. "Would you like a piece?" offered Sarah, already cutting a slice before even hearing the answer. Mrs. Wilson, a woman in her 60s who rarely spoke, watched the scene with wide eyes, clearly fearing a reprimand from her employer. To the surprise of both, Richard accepted the plate and sat at the kitchen table, something he hadn't done in decades. The first forkful instantly transported him to his childhood in Virginia, to his maternal grandmother's kitchen, where he spent his school vacations. "It's delicious," he murmured, almost inaudible. Sarah's smile widened even more, while Mrs. Wilson seemed not to believe what she was witnessing. "My grandmother used to say that food has the power to heal the soul," commented Sarah, also sitting at the table, with a naturalness that defied all hierarchies in that house. She came from rural Texas and knew recipes that were passed down from generation to generation. She said each dish carries the history of who taught it. Richard chewed slowly, allowing the memories awakened by the familiar flavor to surface. He remembered Elizabeth, who loved to cook on weekends. After her departure, the kitchen had become just a functional space, without life. "Have you always been like this?" The question escaped before he could contain it. "Like what?" Sarah tilted her head, curious. "So, alive," he replied, unable to find a better word. Sarah laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed through the kitchen. "Oh, I don't know if that's exactly right. I have my difficult days too. But I learned from my mother that we can choose how we face life, even when it's not easy. And I choose to see beauty in small things." The simplicity of that philosophy contrasted with the complexity of the dark thoughts that had inhabited Richard's mind for so long. How could someone who worked hard in 2 jobs, still studying at night, maintain that inner light? In the days that followed, Richard found himself observing Sarah more carefully. He noticed how she talked to the plants while watering them, how she sang different songs depending on the room she was cleaning, how she left small arrangements of wildflowers, which she probably collected on her way to work, in strategic corners of the house. One day, returning earlier from a meeting, he found her in the library, absorbed in reading one of the books he had allowed her to borrow. It was a collection of poems by Robert Frost. So concentrated was she that she didn't notice his presence until he softly cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," she quickly closed the book, embarrassed. "I've already finished my work. I was just enjoying a few minutes before leaving." "Don't worry," he replied, gesturing for her to remain seated. "Which poem were you reading?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then opened the book again. "The Road Not Taken. That one about the 2 roads diverging in a wood. It's beautiful, but a little sad." Richard approached and sat in the opposite armchair. "Do you know the most common interpretation of that poem? About life's choices?" she ventured. "Yes, but it goes beyond that," explained Richard, surprising himself with his own enthusiasm. "It's about how certain experiences remain marked in our memories, like stones we can't remove from our path." "Like traumas?" asked Sarah, her dark eyes fixed on him with genuine interest. "Or losses," he replied, looking away to the window, where the Miami afternoon was beginning to say goodbye. A comfortable silence settled between them until Sarah, with her usual spontaneity, broke the moment. "Have you ever thought that maybe you don't need to remove the stone? That maybe you can build something with it, instead of trying to take it out of the way?" The question, seemingly simple, hit Richard like lightning. In 20 years, no one had suggested that his pain could be transformed into something different, that it didn't need to be just an obstacle to be circumvented or ignored. Before he could respond, the phone rang. It was Gerald informing him that his son Michael was in the lobby of the building. "I need to go," said Sarah, getting up quickly. "My other job starts soon. Can I return this book next week?" Richard nodded, still absorbing the impact of her words. When the library door closed, he remained motionless, contemplating how a simple cleaning lady managed, with few words, to demolish the thought structures he had meticulously built for 2 decades. Michael's unexpected visit broke his thoughts. His only son, now 35, was practically a stranger. After Elizabeth's departure, Richard had emotionally distanced himself, unable to deal with the pain reflected in his son's eyes, so similar to his mother's. Michael grew up under the care of his maternal grandmother and, now an adult, maintained only a formal and distant relationship with his father. "It's been a while, Dad," said Michael as he entered the living room. Tall like Richard, but with Elizabeth's delicate features, he dressed with the discreet elegance of new Miami businessmen. "To what do I owe the visit?" asked Richard, offering a drink that was politely refused. "I came to personally deliver the invitation to my wedding," replied Michael, extending an envelope of textured paper. "It will be in 2 months." Richard received the envelope with slightly trembling hands. His son was getting married, and he barely knew the bride. What kind of father had he become? "I'll be honored to attend," he replied formally. Michael nodded without showing much emotion. "I hope this time you actually show up," he said, referring to the numerous important occasions Richard had missed over the years, always with the excuse of work. When Michael left, Richard felt the weight of his choices as never before. His son's visit, combined with Sarah's words about transforming stones into constructions, planted a seed of restlessness in his spirit. For the first time in many years, he began to question the wall he had built around himself. The routine in the Atlantic Tower penthouse was beginning to take on new contours. The days when Sarah appeared brought a different energy to the environment, as if the walls absorbed some of her vitality. Richard, although reluctant, felt increasingly comfortable with that presence that challenged his self-imposed isolation. On a Thursday afternoon, while organizing some documents in his office, Richard heard a dull thud coming from the room that had belonged to Elizabeth, followed by a muffled exclamation. Moved by a curiosity he couldn't control, he headed to the place he rarely visited. Upon opening the door, he found Sarah kneeling on the floor, collecting sheet music that had fallen from a box. She looked up, visibly embarrassed to be in that almost sacred space. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan," she said quickly. "Gerald asked me to clean this room today. He said it was time to air out the place a bit. I didn't want to touch anything important. I was just dusting when this box slipped." Richard felt the initial impulse to reprimand her, to say that no one should touch Elizabeth's things, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was Sarah's sincerely apologetic eyes, or perhaps it was the fact that, for the first time in 2 decades, someone besides him was handling those sheet music with genuine care. "It's okay," he replied, approaching to help her. "They're just old papers." As they collected the scattered sheet music, Sarah's fingers touched a yellowed envelope that had slipped under the dresser. She picked it up delicately, and as she turned it over, her eyes widened as she read the name written in elegant handwriting on the front. For Richard. "Mr. Sullivan," she called with a soft voice, extending the envelope. "I think this is for you." Richard immediately recognized Elizabeth's handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope. How had he never found that letter before? How many times had he entered that room, touched that box of sheet music, without ever noticing its existence? "Excuse me," murmured Sarah, perceiving the emotion on her employer's face. "I'll finish cleaning later." She discreetly left, closing the door behind her, leaving Richard alone with the letter and his memories. He sat on the edge of the bed, the same place where he used to sit to listen to Elizabeth play the piano on Sunday afternoons. With almost reverential care, he opened the envelope, preserved by time like a forgotten treasure. "My dear Richard," the letter began, written in the firm and elegant handwriting he knew so well. "If you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer physically by your side. I don't know how much time has passed since my departure, but I know that, knowing you as I do, you've probably closed yourself in your pain, like a shell protects its pearl." Elizabeth's words, coming from the past, crossed the 2 decades of silence like accurate arrows. Richard felt tears. How long had it been since he'd cried? Blur his vision. "My love, life is too precious a gift to be lived by halves. Don't let my absence be greater than the presence of everything that can still be lived. Michael will need you, whole and present, and you, my stubborn Richard, will need someone who brings music back into your life." The letter continued with Elizabeth talking about her dreams for Michael's future, about how she would like the music foundation they had started together to continue, about how she wished Richard would find reasons to smile again. "Promise me, Richard, that you won't transform our love into a prison, that you'll use the longing not as a weight but as an impulse to live each day fully. Promise me that you'll allow new melodies to fill the spaces I've left empty. This is my last request and my greatest wish, to see you from wherever I am dancing with life again." The letter ended with a phrase that was like a secret between them. In every piano note, in every sunset, in every sip of morning coffee, I'll be with you. With all my love, eternally, Elizabeth. Richard let the tears flow freely, allowing himself for the first time in 20 years to fully feel the pain of loss without barriers, without containment. It was as if the letter had opened a floodgate in his heart, releasing not only the contained sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. Elizabeth's words were an absolution he never knew he needed. When he finally managed to compose himself, it was already night. He left the room holding the letter against his chest, and found Gerald in the hallway with a worried expression. "Are you all right, sir?" asked the faithful butler, who had witnessed his emotional decline up close after losing Elizabeth. "Yes, Gerald," replied Richard with a different voice, as if something had transformed inside him. "Is Miss Rodriguez still here?" "No, sir. She left a few hours ago looking quite concerned about you." Richard nodded, thoughtful. "Tomorrow when she comes, I'd like you to send her to my office as soon as she arrives." Gerald agreed, not hiding his surprise at that unusual request. Next morning, Sarah arrived punctually at 8 a.m. as usual. When informed by Gerald that the boss wanted to see her, her face expressed a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," she said as she entered the office, where Richard was waiting, standing, looking out the window. "At the Miami Sea." "Good morning, Sarah," he replied, turning to face her. His eyes, normally cold and distant, had a different shine that morning. "Please sit down." She obeyed, nervously adjusting the simple uniform she wore to work. "I would like to thank you," he began, with a voice that Sarah had never heard before, softer, almost vulnerable, "for finding that letter yesterday." "No need to thank me, sir." "It was an accident," she replied, relaxing a bit as she realized she wouldn't be reprimanded. "Accidents are sometimes just destiny in disguise," commented Richard, sitting across from her. "That letter was written by my wife before her departure. Somehow it remained hidden all these years, waiting for the right moment to be found." Sarah smiled gently without interrupting. "I'd like to make you an offer," he continued. "There is a foundation, the Melody Foundation, that my wife and I started many years ago. It was a project to bring music education to children from underprivileged communities. After her departure, I neglected the foundation. It still exists, but not with the original purpose. I'd like to revitalize it and thought that with your education training and your evident love for music, you could help me." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But sir, I'm just a student. I haven't even graduated yet." "You have something that diplomas don't teach, Sarah. You have passion for life and for art. That's what Elizabeth valued above all." He paused, as if gathering courage. "I'm offering a full-time job with a higher salary than your 2 current jobs combined, and flexible hours, so you can complete your studies." Sarah remained silent for a few seconds, processing the unexpected offer. "But what about cleaning?" "Your house." "I'll hire someone else," he replied simply. "So do you accept?" Yes, I accept," she finally exclaimed, unable to contain her emotion. "It's an incredible opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Richard," he corrected. "If we're going to work together, you can call me Richard." That moment marked the beginning of a new phase in both their lives. Richard, driven by Elizabeth's posthumous words, was taking the first step to leave the cocoon of solitude in which he had enclosed himself. Sarah, without knowing it, was the instrument of a transformation that was just beginning. The headquarters of the Melody Foundation was in a historic mansion in the Coral Gables neighborhood with a view of Biscayne Bay. The imposing building, of Spanish colonial architecture, meticulously restored, seemed dormant when Richard and Sarah arrived that sunny morning. The administrative staff, accustomed to seeing the owner only on rare formal occasions, were visibly surprised by his presence, and even more by the unknown young woman accompanying him. "Good morning," greeted Richard to the middle-aged receptionist, who looked at him open-mouthed. "This is Sarah Rodriguez, the new educational projects coordinator of the foundation. Please arrange a badge and full access for her." The woman nodded quickly, still processing the unexpected information, as Richard conducted Sarah on a tour of the building. Each room revealed a bit more of Elizabeth's original vision. Classrooms equipped with musical instruments that hadn't been used for years, a small auditorium with perfect acoustics, a specialized music library with sheet music, and rare books. "It's amazing," murmured Sarah, reverently touching a grand piano in the center of the auditorium. "A place like this practically abandoned." "Not abandoned," corrected Richard, with a defensive note in his voice. The foundation continued to function administratively, managing a fund that finances scholarships in conservatories. But yes, the original project of direct teaching to children, that was interrupted. Sarah ran her fingers over the piano keys, producing a simple but harmonious melody. "You know how to play?" asked Richard, genuinely surprised. "A little," she replied, with a shy smile. "My mother cleaned the house of a piano teacher in Coral Gables. Sometimes when she finished work early, the teacher would let me practice. I didn't have formal lessons, I learned by ear." Richard observed her for a moment, noticing how her hands moved naturally over the keys, as if conversing with the instrument. It was a raw talent, without refined technique, but there was something genuine in the way she surrendered to the music. "What was the name of this teacher?" he asked out of curiosity. "Mrs. Nancy Davis," replied Sarah, still playing softly. "A wonderful lady, very patient with me. She said I had a good ear." Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. Nancy Davis was an old friend of Elizabeth's. They had studied together at the Miami Conservatory of Music. "You knew my wife?" The question came out almost as a whisper. Sarah abruptly stopped playing, her eyes meeting Richard's with an expression of shock. "Your wife was Elizabeth Sullivan, the pianist?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "Mrs. Davis spoke of her with such affection. I was very small, but I remember seeing her a few times. She used to visit Mrs. Davis and always brought sweets for me." Richard's world seemed to spin in slow motion. Through an intricate game of destiny, Sarah had known Elizabeth, had been touched by her kindness decades ago, and now was there before him, like a living bridge to the past he had tried to bury. She gave lessons to children from the community where I lived," continued Sarah, her eyes now moist with tears. "A social music project. I participated for a few months before she could no longer teach." Richard sat heavily in one of the auditorium chairs. The project Sarah was referring to was the embryo of the Melody Foundation, started by Elizabeth even before the foundation was officially established. "So you were one of her students," he stated, feeling an indescribable emotion. "One of her last students." Sarah nodded, discreetly, wiping away a tear. "It was because of her that I fell in love with music and education. She used to say that teaching was like composing a symphony, where each child was a unique instrument, with their own sound, their own contribution." The coincidence was too great to be ignored. Somehow destiny had brought into Richard's life someone who carried within herself a seed planted by Elizabeth. As she had written in the letter, someone who brings music back into your life. The days that followed were of intense work at the foundation. Sarah, with her contagious enthusiasm, helped to elaborate a plan to revitalize the educational programs. Her experience as Elizabeth's student, combined with her studies in education, brought a valuable and authentic perspective to the project. Richard, in turn, was rediscovering the purpose he had lost along with Elizabeth. Seeing him involved in meetings, discussing ideas with renewed passion, surprised the Foundation's older employees, who for years had known him only as a distant and austere figure. On a particularly productive afternoon, while reviewing the budget for the purchase of new instruments, Richard noticed that Sarah seemed especially thoughtful. "Something wrong?" he asked, now more attentive to the young woman's moods. "No, it's nothing," she initially replied, but faced with Richard's insistent look, continued, "It's just that I'm remembering something your wife once said, about how music has the power to build invisible bridges between people. I think I'm seeing that happen here between us two, between you and this project, between the past and the present." Richard felt a knot in his throat. It was exactly the kind of observation Elizabeth would make, this ability to see deep connections where others would see only coincidences. "You know," continued Sarah, "when Mrs. Davis found out I was going to work as a cleaner in your house, she told me something curious. She said that perhaps it wasn't a coincidence, that perhaps it was the circle closing. At the time I didn't understand what she meant, but now—" "You still keep in touch with Nancy?" asked Richard, interrupting her. "Yes, of course. She's older, doesn't teach anymore, but still plays beautifully. I visit her once a month." Richard hesitated for a moment, as if he were making a difficult decision. Do you think she would like to see me?" Sarah's smile illuminated the entire room. "I'm sure she would. She always speaks of you and Mrs. Elizabeth with so much affection. I think she would be very happy." That conversation opened another door in the emotional labyrinth where Richard had been lost for so many years. Nancy Davis had been like a sister to Elizabeth, but after her departure, Richard had cut contact with everyone who brought painful memories, including his wife's old friend. The next day, a sunny Saturday, Richard found himself in front of an apartment door in Coral Gables, his heart racing like a teenager's. Sarah was by his side, holding a bouquet of lilies, Mrs. Davis's favorite flowers. "Don't worry," whispered Sarah, noticing his nervousness. "She'll be very happy to see you." The door opened, revealing an elegant lady with completely white hair, tied in an impeccable bun. Her blue eyes, still lively and bright, widened in surprise before filling with tears. "Richard," Nancy's voice trembled slightly. "My God, how long—" "Hello, Nancy," he replied, feeling simultaneously ashamed of the abandonment and relieved by the reunion. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Nancy opened her arms and, without hesitation, wrapped Richard in a tight hug. "You could never bother me, my dear. I'm so happy you finally came." Nancy's apartment was a testimony to her passion for music, meticulously organized sheet music, a well-preserved upright piano, photographs of performances and students over the decades. On a prominent shelf, Richard saw a photo that made him stop. He, Elizabeth, and Nancy, young and smiling, in front of the Miami Adrienne Arsht Center for the Performing Arts on the night Elizabeth made her debut as a soloist. "She would be so proud of you," said Nancy, noticing his fixed gaze on the photograph, "for taking up the Foundation's work again, for living again." The visits to Mrs. Davis became a Saturday ritual for Richard and Sarah. With each meeting, more stories about Elizabeth emerged, more memories were shared, and the weight that Richard carried in his chest seemed to gradually diminish. Nancy, with her years of wisdom, had become a kind of advisor for both, offering guidance for both the Foundation's projects and the emotional journey that Richard was treading. The Melody Foundation was gaining new life. After weeks of intense planning, the music education program for children from underprivileged communities would be relaunched. New instruments were acquired, teachers hired, and partnerships with public schools established. Richard, driven by a renewed purpose, dedicated himself entirely to the project, finding in the realization of Elizabeth's dream a way to honor her memory. Sarah, in turn, was revealing herself to be an exceptional collaborator. Her theoretical knowledge in education, combined with her natural intuition and life experience, brought a unique perspective to the work. Between them, a complicity grew each day, nourished by the shared purpose and the stories that connected them through Elizabeth. On a rainy September morning, Richard was in his office at the Foundation, reviewing documents for the reopening ceremony, when he heard a noise coming from the auditorium. It was followed by a muffled cry and the unmistakable sound of something heavy falling. "Sarah?" he called, getting up quickly. There was no response. With his heart racing, Richard ran to the auditorium, only to find Sarah fallen on the floor. Near the stage, a ladder toppled at her side indicated what had happened. She was trying to hang decorative banners for the inauguration event when the ladder slid on the waxed floor. "Sarah." Richard knelt beside her, panic taking over his body. The scene was terribly familiar. Elizabeth had also suffered a fall, the beginning of the illness that eventually took her away. "Speak to me, please." Sarah moaned in pain, slowly opening her eyes. "Richard, I think I hurt my ankle." The relief Richard felt was so intense he almost laughed. "Thank God, I was afraid." Carefully, he helped Sarah to sit up. Her ankle was visibly beginning to swell, and she couldn't put her foot on the floor. "I'm taking you to the hospital right now," he declared, leaving no room for argument. In the emergency room, while waiting for the X-ray results, Richard remained abnormally silent, his face marked by a concern that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "It's just a sprain, Richard," said Sarah, trying to calm him. "You don't need to be like this." He shook his head, unable to explain the whirlwind of emotions the accident had awakened. How to tell her that, for a terrible moment, he thought history was repeating itself, that the fear of losing someone important again had paralyzed him. Important. The word echoed in his mind. When had Sarah become so important in his life? The doctor confirmed the diagnosis, a moderate ankle sprain, nothing a few weeks of rest wouldn't solve. However, Those weeks meant that Sarah couldn't easily get around, much less work at the foundation during the final preparations for the inauguration. "You're going to stay at my house," declared Richard on the way back, surprising both Sarah and himself with the sudden decision. "What do you mean?" "Ooh, you don't need to, Richard. I can manage in my apartment." "Your apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator," he reminded her. "How do you intend to go up and down the stairs with that ankle? Besides, we need to continue working on the preparations for the inauguration. At my house, you'll have all the necessary comfort to recover, and we can work together." The logic was impeccable, but both knew there was something more behind that decision, an almost desperate need of Richard's to keep Sarah under his care, to protect her. When they arrived at the Atlantic Tower penthouse, Gerald received them with an expression of surprise that quickly transformed into discreet efficiency. In minutes, the guest room was prepared, and Mrs. Wilson received instructions to prepare a special meal. "I can't believe you're doing all this because of a simple sprain," commented Sarah, as Richard helped her settle into the comfortable bed. "It's not just because of the sprain," he replied seriously. "It's because you are important to the project, to the foundation." A brief silence established itself between them, loaded with unspoken words. Sarah smiled softly, as if understanding what he really wanted to say. The days that followed transformed the routine of the penthouse. What before was a silent and somber space was now filled with Sarah's vibrant presence. Even limited by her reduced mobility, she radiated energy and optimism that contaminated everyone around her. Richard, surprisingly, proved to be an attentive caregiver. He organized his schedule to be able to work from home, provided special cushions to keep Sarah's foot elevated, and even learned to prepare ice compresses at the frequency recommended by the doctor. The nights, previously so lonely, transformed into work sessions that frequently evolved into deep conversations about music, art, philosophy, and life. Richard was rediscovering the pleasure of dialogue, of exchanging ideas, of company. On one of these nights, while reviewing the program for the Foundation's inaugural concert, Sarah made an unexpected suggestion. "What if we included an original piece, something composed especially for the occasion?" Richard raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Are you thinking of a specific composer?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if gathering courage. "Actually, I wrote a small piece. It's simple, nothing elaborate, but it was inspired by the stories you and Mrs. Davis told about Elizabeth." Richard felt his heart accelerate. "You compose?" "Not professionally," she replied with timidity, "but I like to create melodies. This one I wrote in the last few weeks while we were working at the foundation. I called it Invisible Bridges, inspired by that conversation we had. About the connections that music creates. I'd like to hear it," said Richard, his voice softer than he intended. Sarah asked him to bring her tablet, where she had recorded a simple version of the melody using a piano app. The music began softly, almost hesitantly, like a question being asked. Gradually it gained confidence, transforming into a sweet and melancholic melody that somehow conveyed both sadness and hope, like a sunset that, even marking the end of a day, promises a new dawn. When the last chords dissipated in the air, Richard remained silent, eyes closed, absorbing each note as if it were food for his soul. "It's beautiful," he finally said, his voice choked with emotion. "Elizabeth would have loved it." Sarah's smile illuminated her entire face. "Do you really think so? I didn't have formal music education, so—" "Technique can be learned," interrupted Richard, "but the ability to transmit emotion through music, that's a gift. You have that gift, Sarah." That moment marked a subtle but significant change in the relationship between them. The mutual admiration that already existed deepened, gaining new layers. Richard saw in Sarah not just the young woman full of life who had brought light back to his existence, but also a sensitive artist capable of translating into music what many couldn't express with words. The following week, as Sarah's ankle showed signs of improvement, an unexpected visit brought new elements to the dynamic that had established between them. Michael, Richard's son, appeared without warning, apparently to discuss wedding details. The surprise on Michael's face upon finding an unknown young woman comfortably installed in his father's house was evident. Even more surprising was seeing Richard preparing tea in the kitchen, something the son had never witnessed before. "I didn't know you had visitors, Dad," commented Michael with poorly disguised curiosity. "Sarah is staying here temporarily," explained Richard. "She suffered an accident at the foundation and needs care while she recovers." Michael observed the interaction between his father and the young woman with growing interest. The way Richard moved around Sarah, attentive to her needs, the way his eyes softened when she spoke. Everything indicated a profound transformation in the man who, for 20 years, had kept the world at a distance. The presence of Michael in the penthouse brought an interesting dynamic to the coexistence that had established between Richard and Sarah. After the initial shock, Richard's son demonstrated genuine curiosity about the young woman who had somehow achieved what no one had in 20 years, breaking the emotional barrier his father had built around himself. "So you were a piano student of my mother's?" asked Michael, while the three shared dinner on the balcony under the starry Miami sky. "For a very short period," replied Sarah. "I was quite small, but the memories I have of her are very vivid. Your mother had a special way of teaching. She made music seem magical." Michael smiled, a melancholic smile that very much resembled Richard's. "She used to say that music was the language of the universe, that when we play or sing, we're conversing with something greater than ourselves." "Exactly," exclaimed Sarah, her eyes shining. "She used those same words in her classes. It's amazing how I remember that even after so long." Richard observed the interaction in silence, feeling an emotion difficult to name. Seeing his son and Sarah animatedly conversing about Elizabeth, sharing memories celebrating her essence, it was as if somehow his wife's presence was being honored, not through mourning and sadness, but through joy and celebration of who she had been. "Dad, Sarah told me about the foundation's reopening," commented Michael, turning to Richard. "I'd like to participate more actively. Perhaps I can help with the administrative or financial part." The offer caught Richard by surprise. In recent years, Michael had kept his distance from the family business, preferring to build his own career in the financial market. "It would be great to have you involved, son," replied Richard, feeling a wave of gratitude. "The foundation was very important to your mother." "I know," said Michael softly. "I think it's time to honor that legacy. Besides," he added, with a significant look at Sarah, "it seems you've found the perfect partner to revitalize the project." The word partner hung in the air, loaded with meanings that none of the three dared to openly explore at that moment. Sarah blushed slightly, looking away to the view of the illuminated shoreline, while Richard adjusted his tie in a nervous gesture that wasn't characteristic of him. In the days that followed, Michael became a constant presence in the penthouse and at the foundation. The rapprochement between father and son, facilitated by Sarah's mediating presence, brought a new dimension of healing to the process Richard was experiencing. Conversations that had been postponed for decades finally happened, allowing old wounds to begin to heal. Sarah's ankle was gradually improving, but she continued to stay at the penthouse. What had begun as a practical necessity had transformed into a comfortable arrangement that neither seemed anxious to end. The proximity of the foundation's reopening event served as the perfect justification to extend her stay. On a particularly productive afternoon, while Sarah and Richard were finalizing the details of the musical program for the big event, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Davis, with an unexpected request. "Richard, dear, I've been thinking, what do you think about including in the concert that sonata Elizabeth composed, but never got to present publicly? I have the original score. She gave it to me to keep shortly before, well, you know." The suggestion caught Richard by surprise. He knew Elizabeth had worked on a composition in her last months, but had never had the courage to look for or ask about it. "I don't know, Nancy," he replied hesitantly. "Who could play it? It would have to be someone who understood the soul of the piece, the context in which it was created." "I'm thinking of Sarah," replied Nancy straightforwardly. "She has sufficient technique, but mainly she has the necessary emotional connection. Besides, I think Elizabeth would approve of the idea. It would be like a circle closing. After hanging up the phone, Richard remained thoughtful. The idea was audacious, but somehow it seemed perfectly appropriate. When he presented the suggestion to Sarah, however, her reaction was one of pure panic. Me? Play an original composition by Elizabeth Sullivan in public? Richard, have you gone crazy? I don't have the technique for that. Nancy believes you. Do, he replied calmly. And honestly, I believe it too. It's not just about technique, Sarah. It's about understanding the essence of the music, the feeling behind the notes. You have that. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of fear and emotion. I don't want to disappoint you, or her memory. You won't, guaranteed Richard, gently holding her hands. I trust you. That touch, seemingly simple, sent an electric current through both their bodies. For a moment, they remained motionless, hands united, gazes connected, a silent communication more eloquent than any word. Sarah was the first to break the contact, retreating slightly, confused by the intensity of the moment. I'll try, she murmured, but I'll need a lot of rehearsal. The rehearsals began the next day. Mrs. Davis personally brought the original score, handwritten by Elizabeth, with notes in the margins that revealed her creative process. The sonata, titled Rebirth, was technically challenging but of breathtaking beauty. She composed this in her last months, explained Nancy, while showing the score to Sarah. It was as if she knew she wouldn't have time to present it, but still she needed to leave this last musical message. The grand piano that had remained silent in Elizabeth's room for 20 years was finally reopened. Richard hired a technician to tune it, and when the first notes sounded, it was as if the apartment itself sighed with relief, as if the walls had been yearning for that sound for a long time. Sarah dedicated herself to the rehearsals with impressive intensity. Her technical limitations were compensated by a complete emotional surrender to the music. Hour after hour, she repeated difficult passages, absorbing every nuance of the composition, every intention behind the notes. Richard observed her, fascinated by the transformation occurring before his eyes. Each day, Sarah seemed more connected to Elizabeth's essence through that music. At certain moments, when she played certain passages, Richard had the almost supernatural impression that his wife was present in the room, approving that interpretation of her final work. One night, after a particularly intense rehearsal, Sarah abruptly stopped in the middle of a passage and turned to Richard, who was sitting in a nearby armchair. "You loved her very much, didn't you?" she asked softly. Richard breathed deeply before answering. Yes, Elizabeth was extraordinary, not just talented, but genuinely good. She saw beauty in everything and everyone. How did you manage? After losing her, how did you continue? The question, so direct and honest, caught Richard off guard. I didn't, actually, he admitted after a moment of reflection. I merely existed. I breathed, worked, ate, slept, but didn't really live. It was like being frozen in time, unable to move forward. Sarah observed him with compassionate eyes, waiting for him to continue. You know what's saddest, he continued, feeling an almost physical need to share what he had kept for so long. Elizabeth would have hated to see me like this. She was so passionate about life, so determined to enjoy every moment. Wasting 20 years in mourning would have been for her the greatest betrayal of what we lived together. It's never too late to start again, said Sarah softly. I think that's what this music represents, isn't it? Rebirth. Richard nodded, feeling a powerful emotion take hold of his chest. Thank you, he murmured, his voice almost a whisper. For what? She asked, confused. For helping me to live again. The look they exchanged at that moment contained an intimacy that transcended words. Something was being born between them. Something delicate and profound, nourished by music and shared memories. The eve of the grand reopening of the Melody Foundation came quickly. The auditorium had been completely renovated, invitations sent to important figures in the Miami cultural scene, and a group of 50 children from underprivileged communities had been selected to be the first beneficiaries of the revitalized program. On the night before the event, a palpable nervousness took over the penthouse. Sarah obsessively rehearsed, determined to honor Elizabeth's composition with a worthy interpretation. Richard reviewed his opening speech, while Michael coordinated the last logistical details by phone. "I think we're ready," Michael finally declared, hanging up his cell phone. "Everything confirmed for tomorrow." "Almost everything," corrected Richard, heading to a drawer in his office. From it, he removed a small blue velvet box. "There's something I'd like to give you, Sarah." Sarah looked curiously at the small blue velvet box in Richard's hands. Michael, perceiving the intensity of the moment, murmured something about checking some emails and discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. "What is this?" asked Sarah, her voice almost a whisper. Richard opened the box, revealing a delicate, white gold brooch in the shape of a treble clef, with small diamonds encrusted. "It was Elizabeth's," he explained, his voice choked with emotion. "She wore it in all her important performances. It was her lucky charm. A gift from her mother when she gave her first public performance at 12 years old." Sarah took a step back, visibly moved and intimidated. "Richard, I can't accept something so personal, so significant." "I'm not giving it to you to keep," he clarified gently. "I'm asking you to wear it tomorrow when you play her composition. Elizabeth believed this brooch carried the essence of all the music she had ever played, as if each note somehow became impregnated in it." Silent tears ran down Sarah's face. With trembling hands, she delicately touched the brooch, as if fearing it might dissolve at her touch. "It would be an honor," she finally replied, raising her eyes to meet Richard's. What happened next was one of those moments of pure magic that seemed to exist outside of time. Perhaps it was the emotion of the moment, perhaps the physical proximity, or perhaps simply the culmination of feelings that had been silently growing between them. Richard leaned in and, with a gentleness that contrasted with his usual reserve, kissed Sarah. It was a brief kiss, almost chaste but loaded with meanings. When they separated, both seemed equally surprised by what had happened. "I'm sorry," murmured Richard, taking a step back. "I shouldn't have—" "No," interrupted Sarah, her voice firm despite the tears. "Don't apologize, not for that." They remained silent for a few moments, processing the transformation that had just occurred between them. They were no longer just colleagues united by a common project, nor just friends sharing memories. Something deeper and more complex had emerged, something that both feared to name for fear of breaking its spell. "I think we need to rest," Sarah finally said. "Tomorrow will be a big day." Richard nodded, unable to trust his own voice. Sarah held the little box with the brooch against her chest and headed to the guest room, leaving him alone with his turbulent thoughts. That night, sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Richard, in his room, relived the kiss in his mind, trying to understand the whirlwind of emotions that crossed him. There was guilt, yes, the feeling of betraying Elizabeth's memory, but there was also a growing certainty that, somehow inexplicably, his late wife would approve of this connection. Sarah, in turn, contemplated the brooch in the light of the lamp, feeling its symbolic weight. How had a young woman who had started as a cleaning lady reached this point, about to interpret an unpublished composition by a renowned pianist, developing feelings for the widower who, for 20 years, had loved no one? Life had truly mysterious paths. The morning of the grand reopening dawned with a perfectly blue sky over Miami, as if nature itself blessed the event. The old mansion that housed the Melody Foundation was impeccable, decorated with tropical flower arrangements and banners announcing the return of the educational program. Journalists, personalities from the cultural world, potential sponsors, and, most importantly, the children selected for the program, began to arrive at the scheduled time. Richard, wearing an impeccable dark suit, received the guests with a cordiality that surprised those who knew him only as the reclusive businessman of recent years. In the backstage of the auditorium, Sarah adjusted the simple but elegant navy blue dress she had chosen for the occasion. Elizabeth's brooch, pinned near her heart, shone delicately under the lights. Her hands trembled slightly as she mentally reviewed the score of the sonata Rebirth. "Nervous?" Michael's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned, smiling tensely. Terrified would be a more accurate description. Michael smiled, a smile that very much resembled his father's. You know, my mother used to say that nervousness before a performance is just the body preparing to do something extraordinary. Your mother seemed to always have the right words, commented Sarah. Yes, she did, agreed Michael, his gaze becoming thoughtful. You know, I don't remember the last time I saw my father so alive, so present as he has been in the last few weeks. It's as if a light has been relit inside him. Sarah blushed slightly, not knowing how to respond. What I mean, continued Michael, is thank you for bringing my father back to life. And if it means anything to you, I'm sure my mother would approve of what's happening between you two. Before Sarah could respond, an assistant appeared announcing that the ceremony was about to begin. Michael gently squeezed her shoulder in a gesture of support and left to join the guests. On the main stage, Richard began the ceremony with an emotional speech about the history of the foundation, Elizabeth's original vision, and the meaning of the project's revitalization. His voice, normally controlled and formal, vibrated with a genuine emotion that captivated the audience from the first moment. Music has the power to build bridges, he said, repeating the words Elizabeth used to use. Bridges between people, between communities, between the past and the future. Today, as we reopen the Melody Foundation, we are rebuilding a very special bridge, a bridge to the dream that my wife, Elizabeth, envisioned more than 20 years ago. His eyes scanned the audience, finding the attentive faces of the children who would benefit from the program. Mrs. Davis's emotional eyes in the front row, Michael's proud smile. And, at the back of the auditorium, Sarah, awaiting her moment to come on stage. To close this ceremony, I have the honor of presenting something very special, continued Richard. An unpublished composition by Elizabeth Sullivan, created in the last months of her life, never before publicly presented. Rebirth will be interpreted today by the talented pianist Sarah Rodriguez, whose connection with Elizabeth's work transcends time and circumstances. Sarah has not only revitalized this project, but also brought music back to this foundation and to my life. The last phrase, unplanned, escaped his lips like a spontaneous confession, provoking surprised murmurs in the audience. Richard didn't care. It was time to publicly assume what he could no longer deny in his heart. Sarah walked to the piano with firm steps, despite her nervousness. Elizabeth's brooch shone under the stage lights, like a small star guiding her way. She sat down, adjusted the bench, took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes of Rebirth filled the auditorium, delicate like raindrops at the beginning of a storm. The composition began as a lament, deep and melancholic notes that evoked loss and sadness. Gradually, however, the melody evolved, incorporating lighter elements like sunbeams breaking through dark clouds. Sarah played with an emotional surrender that compensated for any technical limitation. Her fingers seemed guided by a force beyond herself, as if Elizabeth somehow was present, conducting the interpretation of her final work. In the audience, there wasn't a single dry eye. Mrs. Davis cried openly, recognizing in the notes the essence of her dear friend. Michael firmly held his fiancée's hand, moved by finally understanding, through that music, the depth of the love his parents had shared. And Richard felt as if the walls he had built around his heart finally completely collapsed. Elizabeth's music, interpreted by Sarah, was like forgiveness, a blessing, a release. The last notes, triumphant and luminous, declared without words what the title already announced: Rebirth. When the last note dissipated in the air, there was a moment of absolute silence, as if the audience needed time to process the emotional experience. Then, like a wave, the ovation began. People stood up, applauding with fervor, some still wiping away tears. Sarah rose, visibly moved, and made a bow. Her eyes sought Richard in the front row, finding in him a look of admiration and something more, something that made her heart race. The reception that followed the ceremony was a whirlwind of congratulations, promises of sponsorship, and media coverage. The project had been a resounding success, ensuring the future of the foundation and its educational program. But for Richard and Sarah, the true triumph was much more personal. They found a moment of relative privacy in a corner of the mansion's garden where the stars were beginning to dot the Miami sky. "You were amazing," said Richard, his voice loaded with emotion. "Elizabeth would have been proud." "I hope so," replied Sarah softly. "I felt as if she was with me somehow, guiding my hands." Richard took her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes. "About last night. The kiss. You don't regret it, do you?" she asked, a slight tremor in her voice. "No," he replied firmly. "I don't regret it. In fact, it's the first thing in 20 years that I feel with absolute certainty. Sarah, you brought music back to my life in every possible sense. I know it seems crazy that we've known each other for a short time, that there are differences between us, but some connections transcend time and logic," she completed, gently squeezing his hands, "like invisible bridges." The smile that illuminated Richard's face at that moment was the same that Elizabeth had loved decades ago, a smile that had remained dormant for 20 long years and that now, finally, was awakening again. 6 months later, the Melody Foundation was a consolidated success. The educational program served more than 200 children, and new units were being planned in other communities. Michael had taken over the administrative direction, revealing himself to be a talented and dedicated manager while maintaining his own work in the financial market. Sarah, now graduated in education, divided her time between teaching at the foundation and developing her musical talent with formal piano and composition lessons. Elizabeth's brooch, which Richard had insisted she keep after the presentation, had become her own lucky charm. As for Richard, the transformation was visible to anyone who knew him before. The austere and reclusive man had given way to someone who smiled easily, who was moved by his students' performances, who spoke openly about the past without pain obscuring the happy memories. On a special afternoon, Richard took Sarah to the cemetery where Elizabeth was buried. It was the first time in 20 years that he had visited the place with his heart at peace. Together, they laid white flowers on the gravestone. "She would have liked you," said Richard, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "In fact, I'm sure that somehow it was she who sent you to me." Sarah smiled, leaning against him. "Invisible bridges," she murmured. "Some connections are too strong to be broken, even by time or distance." As they left the cemetery, hand in hand, Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced for decades. The love for Elizabeth would always be part of him, a sweet and eternal melody in his heart. But now, a new composition was beginning, one that spoke of second chances, of rebirth, of bridges between the past and the future. And, like all good music,